In 2 weeks' time, though, it's 50 years since Queensland Liberal Senator, the late, great Neville Bonner AO, entered the Australian Senate. And he was selected on merit to represent his state and the Liberal Party just 4 years after the Holt Liberal government held the 1967 referendum to essentially recognise that Aboriginal Australians were people for the purposes of the census and so forth. So when you think about it, Neville Bonner's achievement 50 years ago was phenomenal. There wasn't a quota anywhere in sight. And until this particular monumental moment, Neville Bonner's story really was very typical of a person born in 1922. Poor education opportunities. In fact, he only completed year 3. But his personal determination to achieve for himself made him anything but typical. Neville Bonner went on and served the Australian Senate for 12 years. And while he eventually lost the numbers that he needed in the Queensland Liberal Party to stay in a winnable position on the party ticket, Neville Bonner never saw himself as a victim, nor did he believe anyone owed him. He was his own proud man. Neville Bonner inspired many, and he brought his culture and his traditions to work for all Australians. He saw his role as unifying Australians of all backgrounds. I only ever met him a couple of times, but my wife knew him when she was first starting out, and Neville was really in the last year or two of his time as a senator. My wife was a very young coalition staffer in those days, and she often shared travel time with him between Brisbane and Sydney. And there were fun times too, like when Lorraine booked him into a non-smoking seat just for a joke, because they all said he needed to give up the durries. But my wife liked him and admired him, which is, of course, good enough for me. This week is National Sorry Day and National Reconciliation Week. There's been a lot of virtue signalling from the usual political and business woke suspects, but this, I think, masks their consistent failure to recognise the crisis in our first Australian families and the communities they're part of. It hasn't been repaired by the carefully crafted statements we've heard this week. You see, it's what you do when no one's watching which actually counts. And most of the virtue signallers, sadly, seem to be doing nothing. One big failure is to recognise the against the odds achievements of people like Neville Bonner. And those achievements are actually in reach if we make families safe from violence, families safe from the perils of alcohol, poor nutrition, and give them supported educational opportunities. I believe all Australians deserve an equality of opportunity, but we aren't all guaranteed an equal result. But all lives do matter. And a few words over a few days, like we've heard again this week, and that only happens once a year, isn't the answer for the reality of higher than the Australian average infant mortality, poorer than the Australian average education outcomes, earlier than the Australian average death. It's just dreadful what our first Australians continue to suffer. It is a disgrace. Now, a bloke like Neville Bonner may have been gone for now, 22 years, but his example should never be forgotten. But I think actually it has been. I think actually, in a lot of ways, so much of the debate has gone backwards since Neville Bonner's enormous personal political achievement. There's so many in public life who now just prefer to admire problems rather than solve them. There's just too many people who seek to divide us rather than unite us, create more victims and perpetuate situations which, frankly, we should have solved by now. After 120 years since our federation and over 250 years since Cook arrived here, it is sad to think that there are those who want to perpetuate divisive approaches, to create a sort of separate development industry for our first Australians. And by definition, separate development means an Australian apartheid, hurting too many children and their mothers, robbing too many of them of the equality of opportunity that people like Neville Bonner wanted for all of us. And for this, I've got to say to you, I am very sorry. And I am very, very sad and quite angry.